In the year 1740, the Habsburg Empire stood at a precipice. Internally frayed and externally threatened, it was held together by a man whose grip on reality and power was slowly deteriorating. Charles of the Serres, Holy Roman Emperor and last male Habsburg of his line, had spent the final decades of his reign consumed by one overriding concern: ensuring the succession of his daughter Maria Theresa. This objective shaped the foreign and domestic policies of his later years and placed a profound psychological burden on a ruler already beset by personal and political anxieties. As enemies encircled the empire and alliances frayed, Charles's obsession with legacy hardened into desperation, which many historians now believe contributed directly to the breakdown that marked his final days. The root of Charles's fixation lay in the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, a legal decree he issued to ensure his hereditary lands could pass to a female heir. In theory, it was a masterstroke of dynastic planning. In practice, it was a gamble, one that required years of diplomacy, bribes, and promises to foreign powers. By 1740, nearly every major European power had signed off on the agreement. Yet Charles, never fully trusting the good faith of his peers, remained deeply unsettled. His court became a theater of constant vigilance as he questioned not only foreign envoys, but his own ministers and relatives. He demanded displays of loyalty with increasing regularity, and his punishments for perceived disloyalty grew notably harsh. Beyond Vienna, the empire's edges trembled. The Ottomans remained a threat in the southeast, while the Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire eyed Habsburg authority with growing defiance. France, Prussia, and Bavaria each nursed ambitions that threatened the balance of power Charles had labored to maintain. Spain, still bitter over the War of the Spanish Succession, eyed Italy and the Netherlands with suspicion. In this volatile context, the emperor redoubled his efforts to keep his fragile inheritance intact, all while the pressures of age and illness began to take their toll. Charles was not a natural leader. Unlike his more politically astute predecessors, his strength lay not in strategy but in routine. He was a bureaucrat in royal robes, methodical, pious, and rigid. Yet as the 1730s gave way to the 1740s, that rigidity turned into something darker. Contemporaries noted the emperor's increasing irritability and obsessive behaviors. He insisted on reviewing documents multiple times a day, even those of trivial importance. He held audiences at increasingly erratic hours. On more than one occasion, he was seen pacing alone in palace corridors, muttering to himself about betrayal and divine punishment. These signs in isolation might have been dismissed as the eccentricities of age. But within his court, whispers began to circulate that Charles was slipping into a state of paranoia. He began to fear poisoning an old Habsburg obsession and issued new protocols for the preparation and tasting of his food. Silver forks were examined for residue. Wine was sampled by multiple stewards before it touched the imperial lips. The emperor's personal physicians were instructed to inspect his meals despite their protests that such measures bred more risk than security. This obsession would prove grimly prophetic. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals a court locked in bureaucratic inertia as ministers feared contradicting the emperor's increasingly erratic directives. One chilling episode involved the imperial archives. Convinced that they contained forgeries planted by enemies within, Charles ordered the midnight seizure of dozens of documents. He then burned several personally wearing gloves and an herbal mask as court historians watched in stunned silence. Whether the documents were authentic or not was beside the point. The emperor had acted on instinct, not evidence. This period also saw Charles withdrawing from public ceremonies, a marked change for a monarch who had long understood the performative power of imperial spectacle. Annual parades were reduced or canceled. The lavish court rituals of Vienna lost their splendor, replaced by hushed formalities and ambiguous orders. Foreign envoys noted with concern the atmosphere of caution, even fear, that now dominated the Hofburg. A fog has descended upon the emperor's court, one French ambassador wrote in a dispatch, and none can say if the sun shall rise again. But even as Charles's psychological state decayed, the machinery of empire ground forward. The treasury, however, depleted, continued to fund the military. The bureaucracy still collected taxes. Yet cracks appeared more frequently. Rebellions flared in Hungary over conscription quotas. In Italy, imperial governors complained of lawlessness and declining morale. The emperor responded with proclamations long legalistic and often contradictory, bearing his seal, but revealing the disconnection between Vienna and its periphery. Perhaps most troubling to his inner circle were Charles's private confessions. In the months leading up to his fatal illness, he spoke often of omens and divine displeasure. He reportedly kept a portrait of his great-great-grandfather Charles V in his study and held long whispered conversations with it late at night. Servants claimed to hear him apologizing for the empire's decline, for the concessions to heretics, and for the sins of weak sons. Whether such episodes were the result of stress illness or hereditary affliction remains debated, but they reflect a ruler burdened not only by politics, but by metaphysical guilt. It is within this pressure cooker of dynastic anxiety, diplomatic instability, and creeping madness that the final terrifying chapter of Charles VI's life began. The storm had not yet broken, but its low thunder could be heard beneath the marble corridors of his palace. In those final weeks before his fatal meal, the emperor became a man imprisoned by his own fears, grasping at control, while the world beneath his feet began to shift. And when the end came, it came not in battle or betrayal, but through the most mundane and insidious of acts, a simple dish served at a hunting lodge. The exact moment when Emperor Charles VI's mental state began to unravel remains elusive, but by early 1740, his descent had accelerated beyond the bounds of courtly rumor. What had once been perceived as eccentricity now bore the unmistakable hallmarks of psychological decline. His behavior, increasingly erratic and untethered from political reality, unsettled even the most loyal members of his inner circle. Ministers began to document odd instructions, reversals of policy within hours, and a near-obsessive preoccupation with threats that often lacked any basis in fact. The emperor had always displayed a devout religious temperament, yet this piety evolved into something more anxious and compulsive. He began to order multiple daily masses, not just for his own soul, but for long-dead ancestors, obscure saints, and even deceased courtiers. He ordered the exhumation of a minor Habsburg noble whose remains were thought to have been improperly buried, insisting that divine wrath would fall upon the dynasty unless the body was relocated. Such gestures, once dismissed as harmless ritualism, took on a more disturbing cast. Some courtiers reported that he had taken to flagellating himself in private, a penance he believed necessary to avert divine punishment for the sins of his court and forebears. More unsettling still were the imperial mandates he issued in this period. One decree preserved in Vienna's Haus-, Hof- und Staatsarchive ordered the creation of a secret registry of suspicious glances observed among the palace servants. Another proposed the construction of a chapel with walls thick enough to block the screams of souls in purgatory, an idea so bizarre and costly that his ministers quietly suppressed it. Even veteran statesmen like Friedrich Karl von Schönborn, who had served loyally for decades, began to distance themselves from daily governance. Charles's obsession with poisoning intensified to a near-delusional level. No fewer than 4 tasters were assigned to each dish, each required to wait a full quarter hour before the emperor would eat. The court kitchens, once a hub of fine culinary innovation, were turned into sterile inspection sites. Dogs and birds were sometimes fed sample portions, an ancient technique revived at Charles's command. He even commissioned alchemists and apothecaries to test for mythical poisons, including those that rot the mind and soul before the body. These bizarre measures signaled a mind retreating into a world governed more by fear than reason. Physicians were regularly summoned not to treat illness, but to reassure. Charles demanded bloodlettings, pulse checks, and urine analyses with such frequency that his doctors feared causing harm through the very treatments they administered. Some records indicate he underwent up to 3 bleedings per week during the summer of 1740, more than any sound medical logic would suggest. His primary physician, Gerard von Swieten, recorded his concern in private correspondence, noting that the emperor's pulse does not match the clarity of his words. For while he speaks of providence, his body betrays its confusion. Despite these disturbing developments, the court maintained the outward formality of imperial governance. Dossiers were still compiled, audiences still held, but they increasingly lacked coherence. Foreign ambassadors began submitting the same memorandum multiple times in slightly different wording, knowing that Charles might interpret them differently depending on his state of mind. This bureaucratic workaround allowed diplomacy to function in a limited sense, but it also highlighted the emperor's unreliability. Behind palace doors, courtiers formed quiet factions. Some hoped to steer policy until Maria Theresa's eventual succession. Others, more cynical, sought personal gain while the emperor remained vulnerable. Tensions within the imperial family grew acute. Archduchess Maria Theresa, intelligent and aware of her father's condition, was kept at arm's length from state affairs despite having been designated his heir. Charles, it seems, vacillated between preparing her for rule and doubting her capability, perhaps a reflection of his own diminishing clarity. There were moments of stark contradiction. In some audiences, Charles appeared lucid, even commanding. He could recall treaties by name, cite obscure clauses, and debate matters of canon law with surprising precision. Yet, mere hours later, he might claim to have seen a black raven perched upon his throne, an omen of death in Austrian folklore, or command his aides to send a letter to Emperor Frederick III dead for over 2 centuries. One disturbing incident occurred in late summer when Charles ordered the execution of a palace steward he suspected of espionage. Though the steward was ultimately spared through intervention by his ministers, the fact that Charles had bypassed legal protocol and insisted on a closed-door confession alarmed many. According to an aide's written account, Charles shouted at the man, "The Holy Ghost tells me your blood screams treason?" The servant was later quietly dismissed and paid off, but the episode was whispered about for weeks. These episodes prompted covert consultations among senior advisors. Should the emperor be declared unfit to rule? Could a regency be instituted without provoking political collapse? Yet the idea of deposing the Holy Roman Emperor and anointed sovereign remained an unthinkable taboo. In an age where divine right was still embedded in political theology, mental illness was poorly understood and even more poorly addressed. There existed no legal framework for removing an emperor due to madness, and few dared risk the consequences of trying. It was against this volatile backdrop that Charles prepared for his final journey, an annual hunting trip to the Imperial Lodge at Favorita southeast of Vienna. The trip, a long-standing tradition, was initially resisted by his physicians who feared the exposure to autumn weather and the stress of travel. But Charles insisted. He claimed he had received a dream vision of St. Leopold, patron saint of Austria, urging him to hunt one last time in the lands of his fathers. Reluctantly, the court complied. The emperor's entourage traveled in early October. Witnesses noted that Charles seemed momentarily invigorated by the countryside. He gave orders with a firm voice and walked unaided through dew-soaked fields. Yet even here his paranoia followed. He insisted that every gun be disassembled and reassembled under supervision, and that his meals be inspected by 4 different officials, none of whom were allowed to speak to one another during the process. On the 3rd day of the hunt, a meal was served that would change the course of European history. It consisted of game bread and a dish of stewed mushrooms purportedly gathered fresh from the surrounding woods. Charles, apparently reassured by his extensive precautions, consumed the mushrooms without hesitation. Within hours, he began to complain of sharp abdominal pain. His skin grew pale, his lips cracked. That evening, the imperial physicians were summoned by torchlight to his quarters. The emperor lay groaning, clutching his sides, his pulse faint and rapid. What followed was a storm of panic, confusion, and suspicion, yet no one dared speak the obvious. The emperor had likely been poisoned. And if that were true, the empire stood on the brink of catastrophe. The events that unfolded after the emperor consumed the fatal meal at Favorita Lodge quickly escalated from a medical crisis to a court-wide emergency. At first, the symptoms were attributed to indigestion or a seasonal illness, nothing extraordinary for a man of 55 in declining health. But within 12 hours, the situation deteriorated alarmingly. Charles suffered from violent vomiting, cold sweats, and unrelenting cramps. His face turned ashen, his speech slurred, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. By nightfall, the initial diagnosis of mild food poisoning was replaced with a far more urgent and terrifying possibility: intentional poisoning. The mushrooms had not been sourced from the imperial kitchens in Vienna. According to the investigation that followed, they were foraged locally, an unusual departure from court protocol. Foragers from the surrounding countryside had supplied them, and they had passed through several hands before reaching the emperor's plate. Despite Charles's exhaustive safety rituals, the redundancy of his taster system had, for reasons never fully clarified, failed. One taster fell ill later the same evening, though his symptoms were less severe. The other 3 experienced nothing at all. This discrepancy intensified the speculation that something more insidious had occurred. The exact species of mushroom consumed remains unknown, but historical speculation points to Amanita phalloides, the infamous death cap. Its toxins are slow-acting, deceptive, and brutally effective, often giving a temporary appearance of recovery before delivering fatal organ failure. Such a substance would have been a calculated choice for any would-be assassin, providing a window of confusion and delay before suspicion could take hold. Yet no definitive evidence ever surfaced to prove assassination. The official record described the illness as a malignant colic, a term used to cover a wide range of fatal gastrointestinal conditions, conveniently imprecise. Back in Vienna, the news of the emperor's illness set off a wave of frantic activity. Messages were dispatched to leading physicians, including Gerard van Swieten, who rode day and night to reach the lodge. The Empress Elizabeth Christine was reportedly distraught and demanded prayers be held in every church in Vienna. But more telling was the reaction of the court factions. Rather than rallying around the emperor, they began positioning themselves for the power vacuum that now seemed inevitable. Ministers reviewed succession papers, revised treaties, and sent discreet letters to foreign capitals. The political body of the Habsburg monarchy was already preparing for Charles's death, even as he still fought for life. Within the lodge, the atmosphere turned macabre. The emperor, writhing in pain and racked with fever, began to issue confused commands. He demanded that foreign ambassadors be brought to his bedside at one point, insisting that the French envoy kneel before him and swear allegiance to Maria Theresa. When told that the envoy was not present, Charles became enraged, threatening to tear the crown from the Reich with his bare hands. His words carried little coherence, but his fury was unmistakable. As his condition worsened, he developed intermittent periods of lucidity, brief moments, during which he attempted to dictate letters and issue orders. In one, he requested that his daughter be crowned within the week, as if time itself could be suspended to ensure the security of his legacy. In another, he ordered an inquest into the court kitchens, believing them infiltrated by Protestant agents. His ministers complied if only to keep him calm, but these directives held no legal weight. By the third day, Charles could no longer speak clearly. He slipped into a semi-conscious state, drifting in and out of delirium. Among the strangest and most disturbing details of this period is a little-known report by a Jesuit confessor who attended to the emperor in his final days. According to his account, Charles experienced hallucinations involving fire serpents and a man in black robes who followed him from room to room, whispering, "Your blood is not your own." The emperor reportedly screamed during the night, lashing out at invisible figures and accusing his ancestors of cursing him with a throne of bones. These symptoms, consistent with severe hepatic failure caused by mushroom toxins, also bore the psychological weight of generational guilt, a burden Charles had carried throughout his reign. Outside the lodge, guards were doubled. No one was permitted to enter or exit without explicit approval. Inside, the emperor's room was kept dark, and incense was burned continuously, both to soothe the patient and some believed to ward off evil spirits. The superstitions of the imperial household, normally kept hidden beneath courtly polish, came to the fore. Holy relics were brought to the emperor's bedside, including a splinter of the True Cross and a vial said to contain the blood of Saint Stephen. Charles was too far gone to register their presence. On the fourth day, a consultation was held between Van Swieten and other senior physicians. Their assessment was grim. The emperor's liver and kidneys had failed, and his fever showed no signs of breaking. Charles's abdomen was swollen and tender, his eyes jaundiced. Traditional treatments, emetics, enemas, cuppings had done nothing. The doctors, desperate and likely aware of the futility, turned to mercury chloride and theriac, a medieval concoction once believed to cure poisons. These treatments only increased Charles's agony. Meanwhile, members of the imperial family gathered in silent vigil. Maria Theresa, only 23 at the time, was kept in a separate chamber but was informed of each development. Reports suggest that she pleaded with her mother to let her see her father, but the empress refused, fearing the trauma and the possibility of contagion. Only the emperor's confessor and 2 physicians remained in the room during his final hours. Just before dawn on October 20th, Charles's breathing became erratic. He began to mutter Latin prayers, garbled and barely audible. His hands clutched the sheets, then fell still. Van Swieten placed a silver mirror near his mouth, no mist. The Holy Roman Emperor was dead. His body was cleaned, perfumed, and wrapped according to Habsburg funerary tradition. But in a break from usual protocol, the embalming was delayed. Rumors persisted that traces of poison were being tested, though no findings were ever published. To this day, the question remains, was Charles Heir the victim of carelessness, a rare but deadly fungus, or something far more deliberate? What is beyond dispute is that his death marked the failure of a decades-long project to secure dynastic continuity by force of will alone. And the empire, still cloaked in mourning robes, would soon find itself spiraling into war. Following the emperor's death at Favorita Lodge, the court fell into an uneasy silence, one not of reverence but of calculation. Charles VI had passed away in the early hours of October 20th, 1740, and by sunrise the wheels of succession were already grinding forward. Yet there was no certainty, no unity, and no clear line of control. Despite the pragmatic sanction's decades of diplomatic effort, the European balance of power had not been convinced, only momentarily pacified. Now, with the emperor gone and no male heir to assert authority, Vienna stood on the brink of unraveling. The emperor's body was returned to the Hofburg Palace in a silent procession under heavy guard. Though official bulletins described the transfer with ritual solemnity, eyewitnesses noted that the streets were unusually subdued and the traditional outpouring of grief from the people was muted. Word had spread not only of the emperor's sudden and agonizing death, but also of the strange behaviors he exhibited in his final days. Some whispered of poison, others madness. Among the more devout, it was seen as divine punishment for sins committed by the Habsburg line, sins which, in their view, the emperor had tried and failed to atone for. The court's first concern was containment of political panic, of foreign interference, and of any further rumors of foul play. The imperial physicians quickly issued an official statement attributing the death to acute gastrointestinal failure resulting from spoiled food, deliberately vague and clinical. Any mention of hallucinations, fevered ravings, or Charles's psychological decline was scrubbed from public records. The emperor was to be remembered as a devout and steadfast ruler, not as a man tormented by his own mind in his final hours. Meanwhile, the Hofburg became a hive of discreet activity. Ministers met behind closed doors, drafting protocols for the transition of power. Court clerks updated files on military readiness in Hungary, Bohemia, and the Austrian Netherlands. And Maria Theresa, now Archduchess and de facto ruler, was finally allowed into her father's inner sanctum. It was said she found the room unchanged from the hour of his death, the sheet still crumpled, a candle burned to its base, and a crucifix gripped tightly in the emperor's hand. Whatever private emotions she experienced in that moment, they remained sealed within her. The succession, though legally sanctioned by the Pragmatic Sanction, was far from secure. Several European powers, Bavaria, Prussia, Saxony, and Spain among them, had signed the agreement only under pressure or for political advantage. Now, with Charles VI dead, the incentive to honor it vanished. Austria's enemies sensed weakness. The court's inability to immediately assert a clear and forceful message of continuity only deepened the impression of vulnerability. Inside the imperial palace, factionalism grew sharper. Some advisors, particularly from the older Catholic nobility, questioned whether a woman could truly wield authority over the disparate and fractious territories of the Habsburg monarchy. Others feared that Maria Theresa's youth and inexperience would invite aggression. A few advocated a regency led by her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, but he lacked support among the Viennese elite and was viewed with suspicion by the military establishment. Amid this political infighting, the emperor's remains were subjected to one of the most elaborate funeral rituals in European monarchy. The traditional Habsburg triple burial was carried out in accordance with custom. His body was interred in the imperial crypt, his heart in the Herzgruft of the Augustinian Church, and his entrails in the ducal crypt of St. Stephen's Cathedral. The symbolism of fragmentation, splitting the body into parts to represent different facets of Habsburg identity, was a medieval tradition, but in this context, it felt grimly literal. The empire, too, was about to be divided. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Charles II's posthumous treatment lay not in ritual but in omission. A court memorandum ordered that all medical instruments used during his final illness be destroyed, including surgical tools and tinctures. The imperial physician's notes were sanitized before being deposited into the state archives. A private diary kept by one of the attending Jesuit confessors was mysteriously lost in the weeks following the emperor's death. These omissions suggest an intentional effort to erase evidence of psychological collapse or poisoning, likely out of fear that such details could further undermine the legitimacy of Maria Theresa's succession. The court's fear was not unfounded. Mere weeks after Charles's death, Frederick II of Prussia, later known as Frederick the Great, mobilized his forces and invaded Silesia, launching the War of the Austrian Succession. He cited ambiguities in the pragmatic sanction and cast doubt on Maria Theresa's right to rule. Soon other claimants emerged, including Charles Albert of Bavaria, who would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1742 as Charles VII, breaking the Habsburg monopoly on the title. These political developments had direct consequences for Vienna's internal stability. The court grew increasingly paranoid. Suspected informants were arrested without trial. One particularly disturbing case involved a palace steward who had briefly served Charles VI during his illness. He was accused of conspiring with foreign agents to falsify the emperor's medical records and was subjected to torture under the pretense of extracting confessions. He died in custody. The investigation was never concluded, and the incident was quietly buried in bureaucratic obfuscation. The psychological toll of these developments weighed heavily on those closest to the late emperor. Gerard van Swieten, the imperial physician who had attended Charles during his illness, left Vienna briefly in 1741 under the guise of medical research. In private letters, he expressed doubt about whether he had served the empire or merely managed its decay. He later returned to court as a reformer under Maria Theresa, but the trauma of watching the emperor die in fear and confusion would shadow his subsequent work on public health and mental illness. Even the Catholic Church, long a partner of Habsburg authority, hesitated in its reaction. While Charles was eulogized in sermons across the empire, several senior clerics declined to speak publicly about his death. Some internal ecclesiastical correspondence preserved in monastic archives speaks obliquely of a sovereign tested by flames, not of this world. Such phrasing suggests a spiritual crisis that went beyond mere physical suffering, a veiled acknowledgement of the mental and moral agony that marked Charles's final weeks. For the ordinary people of Vienna, the emperor's death became the stuff of rumor and folklore. Street ballads described him as haunted by his ancestors. Others claimed his ghost wandered the Hofburg at night, dressed in a black robe seeking redemption for sins unspoken. Though clearly fictional, such tales reflect the anxiety that gripped a city that had lost not only a ruler but the illusion of stability. The imperial court may have tried to preserve the dignity of Charles VI in death, but the contradictions of his reign, his bureaucratic precision, paired with personal doubt, his religious devotion tainted by superstition, and his obsession with legacy undermined by mental instability, ensured that the empire he left behind was already beginning to fragment. And as Vienna mourned, Europe prepared to strike. The death of Charles VI had unsealed more than a dynastic crisis it had unleashed, a haunting reflection of a much older imperial trauma. As his body lay entombed in the cold stone of the Capuchin crypt, Charles's mind in his final days had wandered far from the present. Those who witnessed his descent into delirium noted something increasingly eerie in his ravings, the echo of another Habsburg long dead but never forgotten. Charles, the Mad King of France, whose psychological disintegration in the 14th century became a benchmark for royal madness. Whether Charles VI consciously evoked this distant relative is unclear, but the parallels whispered within the Hofburg became too vivid to ignore. For 5 days before his death, Charles VI lay bedridden, consumed by fever liver failure and what appeared to be toxic delirium. These symptoms alone were excruciating, but they also unshackled his already faltering grip on reality. His words grew more disjointed, alternating between prayers in Latin and sudden outbursts of terror. One of his nurses, whose notes were later transcribed by the court apothecary, described a chilling scene in which the emperor shrieked at the foot of his bed, clawing at the air as if warding off invisible enemies. He cried out not for mercy but for silence. Make them stop the screaming, though no one else heard a sound. Charles VI had always believed in omens. Throughout his reign, he frequently interpreted mundane events, broken mirrors, eclipses, sudden deaths as signs from God. But in his final days, these beliefs bloomed into something more pathological. He believed that rats were crawling beneath his skin, that his ancestors stood in judgment at the corners of the room. He refused to eat unless food was first placed upon the floor, for the angels to approve a ritual no known tradition could explain. The emperor began seeing ghosts not metaphorically but with unnerving specificity. He named them Charles Fivers Maximilian II, even Empress Maria of Burgundy, long dead. According to his confessor, he once screamed that Philip II had come to drag him to judgment in chains of gold and fire. When asked what he feared most, Charles whispered, "That my mind will leave me before my soul is taken." It was this awareness, this desperate recognition of his unraveling faculties, that made his deterioration especially tragic. He understood at least in part that he was losing control. At times his behavior mimicked that of Charles VI of France, whose fits of madness had once led him to believe he was made of glass. Like his French namesake, the Holy Roman Emperor became sensitive to touch and light. He demanded all reflective surfaces be removed from his room. Servants were instructed not to speak above a whisper. The curtains were drawn shut for days, even as sunlight faded into the late October gloom. His bed was encircled with religious icons, but he demanded they be turned inward, facing him, not outward, as if to trap divine judgment in the room with him. None of these episodes were recorded in the official imperial diary. Instead, they survived in peripheral documents, court memoirs, physician notes, Jesuit letters smuggled into private libraries. In one striking account, a senior chaplain described an episode in which Charles demanded to confess to the sins of 10 generations. The emperor then proceeded to recite a list of alleged crimes committed by his ancestors, some real, others fantastical regicide, incest, betrayal of saints. The chaplain ended the confession prematurely, fearing that the emperor's agitation would trigger cardiac failure. Medical science in the 18th century had little capacity to understand the physiological and psychological effects of liver failure, much less to differentiate between toxic delirium and hereditary insanity. Mushroom poisoning, especially from Amanita phalloides, can induce severe neuropsychiatric symptoms, hallucinations, convulsions, personality shifts. But in a court steeped in theological and dynastic reasoning, such symptoms were interpreted not as medical consequences, but as signs of divine wrath or demonic temptation. Charles's breakdown was not treated. It was endured. The emperor's attendants, unable to stop the progression of his agony, turned increasingly toward folk remedies and religious intervention. On the third night of his decline, a Corinthian monk was summoned to perform a minor exorcism, not on the emperor himself, but on the room which some believed had become spiritually contaminated. Holy water was sprinkled in the corners, the floor was scrubbed with salt and vinegar, and a candle was burned at the foot of the bed, while sacred hymns were whispered under breath. None of it made any difference. In a final lucid moment, Charles reportedly asked for a portrait of Maria Theresa. Upon receiving it, he stared in silence for several minutes, before placing the frame on his chest and murmuring, "She will not be forgiven." Whether this was a reference to divine judgment or to the empire's likely refusal to accept a female heir is unknown. But it underscores a theme that pervaded his decline, a mixture of dread, guilt, and hopelessness. Though Charles had always been distant from his daughter emotionally, he had staked his political identity on her future. To lose faith in her succession in his final hours reveals how deeply his personal and imperial anxieties had fused. His mental collapse was not just the erosion of cognition, it was a political event, a dynastic symbol, and a moment of spiritual crisis for the Habsburg court. The court physicians and theologians who stood watch in those final days could do little but record and conceal. Charles's ravings could not be made public lest they call into question the divine legitimacy of Habsburg rule. But within the tight circle of witnesses, the horror of the emperor's death was seared into memory. Even decades later, memoirs of court figures who had served during the reign of Maria Theresa refer to her father not as the emperor, but as he who lost his reason. In retrospect, Charles VI's final days are both medically explicable and psychologically revealing. His decline was not merely the result of a poisoned meal, but the culmination of years of internal pressure, dynastic obsession, and untreated paranoia. The convergence of toxic delirium with spiritual dread created a unique and terrifying portrait of imperial collapse. In that room at Favorita Lodge, the Holy Roman Emperor did not simply die, he unraveled. And as he did so too did the illusion of Habsburg invulnerability. As word of Charles VI's death spread through the empire, the outer veneer of imperial confidence quickly peeled away. While the court in Vienna scrambled to maintain order, the underlying machinery of the Habsburg state showed signs of dangerous instability. The emperor had not merely died, he had died under mysterious, grotesque circumstances, and in doing so had left a power vacuum that neither precedent nor planning could immediately fill. The pragmatic sanction. So long the object of Charles's political obsession now stood as a fragile parchment in a world of bayonets and opportunism. His body had barely cooled when Vienna became the site of feverish political maneuvering. On the surface, Maria Theresa was acknowledged as his legal successor. She took possession of the hereditary lands and received oaths of loyalty from key provincial assemblies. But those oaths were strained hesitant and in some cases coerced. The court knew that external threats loomed Prussia. Bavaria, Saxony, and France had never truly accepted a woman's right to rule the Habsburg dominions. Internally, ministers questioned her ability to lead during what was clearly becoming a succession crisis. Within the Hofburg, the emperor's death chamber was sealed, his personal effects inventoried. The bedding and furniture from his final illness were burned or locked away. The physicians who had attended him were instructed to swear oaths of secrecy. But not even the court's tight control over information could prevent the rumors from seeping into Vienna's streets. Some spoke of poisoning, others of madness. Many whispered that Charles had been tormented by demons in his final hours, supernatural punishment for defying divine order by placing a woman on the throne. The medical community in Vienna was divided. While the official diagnosis remained vague, acute intestinal inflammation compounded by age, several physicians quietly speculated that the emperor had succumbed to mushroom poisoning, though none dared publish the claim. Others more traditional in their thinking spoke of melancholy or divine affliction. These debates never made it into public forums. Instead, the medical faculty focused its energy on a more pressing task, keeping Maria Theresa alive politically and literally. Fear for her safety reached a peak in the days after her father's burial. She was moved to Schönbrunn Palace under heavy guard, her food and drink closely monitored. Guards reported 2 incidents in which kitchen staff were found with unlabeled bottles and herbal preparations. One such servant was interrogated for hours and eventually confessed to smuggling medicines for his sick wife, though whether the story was true remains uncertain. Another was expelled from court without trial. The empress-in-waiting became in effect a prisoner of her own palace. Every shadow was suspect, every gesture scrutinized. Her father's most loyal ministers, figures like Gundaker Starhemberg and Philip Kinsky, formed a provisional advisory council acting as both shield and filter. They controlled access to Maria Theresa, managed correspondence, and monitored the press. But even within this circle, unity proved elusive. Some advocated an immediate coronation to project strength. Others warned that such haste might provoke further instability. A few whispered of more radical measures ceding Silesia to Prussia to buy time or arranging a double regency with Francis Stephen. None of these proposals gained traction, but their very existence pointed to the fragility of the Habsburg court. Amid the tension, religious rituals continued in an attempt to impose spiritual order on political chaos. Masses were held daily for the emperor's soul. Candlelight vigils lined the cathedrals of Vienna. Yet even these ceremonies acquired an undertone of dread. In one particularly unsettling account during a requiem service at the Augustinian church, a massive candle broke free from its holder and crashed onto the floor, scattering embers and startling the choir into silence. The congregation, already anxious, interpreted the incident as an ill omen. Superstition began to seep into every corner of court life. Meanwhile, Austria's enemies watched closely. Frederick of Prussia, young and newly crowned, recognized opportunity where others saw uncertainty. On December 16th, less than 2 months after Charles II's death, he crossed into Silesia under the pretext of protecting Protestant rights. In reality, it was a calculated gamble. Austria was unprepared for war. Its leadership untested, its military stretched thin. Frederick's invasion marked the opening of the War of the Austrian Succession, but in many ways it was also a referendum on Charles VI's legacy. That war, which would engulf much of Europe for 8 years, had its roots not in battlefield strategy or religious difference, but in a deathbed, the deathbed of a man whose mind had fractured under the weight of empire. Had Charles died peacefully or even predictably, the situation might have been different. But its sudden and terrifying decline shattered not only his own body, but the illusion of stability that the Habsburgs had so carefully maintained for centuries. In this atmosphere, the medical staff of the court continued to treat Maria Theresa with almost neurotic vigilance. One obscure but telling document reveals that her physician, Dr. Theodor Werndl, was instructed to catalog every herb and chemical within 100 meters of the Empress's residence. Apothecaries were forbidden from preparing tinctures without 2 witnesses. Water sources were tested, tasted, and replaced weekly. The ghost of poisoning, real or imagined, haunted the court just as the ghost of Charles VI haunted its corridors. But for all their vigilance, the court could not escape the deeper rot. Imperial coffers were nearly empty. The army was dispersed and underfunded. The bureaucracy remained intact, but morale was low. In Hungary, unrest smoldered just beneath the surface, and in Bohemia, loyalty to the new empress was uncertain. Every provincial governor was watching to see if Vienna would stand firm or fracture. And amidst this systemic strain, the empress herself bore the greatest burden. Maria Theresa, still reeling from the personal loss of her father, was expected to transform overnight from grieving daughter to sovereign ruler of a crumbling empire. Her education had been strong but incomplete. She knew court protocol theology and statecraft, but she had never commanded an army or negotiated a war. She was immediately confronted with challenges that would have strained the capabilities of any seasoned monarch. There is a documented episode kept out of public record until years later, in which Maria Theresa, surrounded by ministers, broke into tears after receiving news of Prussia's invasion. According to those present, she asked, "Has everything he worked for come to nothing?" It was not only a political question, it was a cry of betrayal from the daughter of a man who had believed until his dying breath that his plans would outlive him. In a final bitter irony, the very mechanisms Charles VI had put in place to ensure continuity, the obsessive rituals, the suppression of dissent, the tightening of court control had created an atmosphere so tense, so opaque, that it could not withstand the shock of his death. The empire staggered into a new era, not with triumph, but with paranoia, improvisation, and fear. And so as war erupted and the old order convulsed, one truth became clear: Charles VI had died in agony. But the empire he left behind would suffer even longer. With the passing of Charles VI and the fragile ascension of Maria Theresa, the long-standing Habsburg order entered a state of free fall. The vacuum left by the emperor's death was not merely symbolic. It was a structural failure that exposed the soft underbelly of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. For all his years of fastidious planning and diplomatic maneuvering, Charles had failed to prepare the empire for the chaos his death would provoke. The moment the crown slipped from his lifeless head, the dominoes began to fall. The initial test came not from within Austria, but from without. Frederick II of Prussia's decision to invade Silesia in December 1740 was swift and stunning. He acted before Vienna could organize a meaningful military response, justifying his aggression with vague appeals to inheritance rights and the defense of Protestant subjects. But the true motives were strategic. Silesia was rich in resources and poorly defended. Within months, Prussian forces had taken the region with minimal resistance, forcing the Habsburg military into a defensive posture before Maria Theresa had even formally consolidated power. This lightning strike revealed the fragility of the so-called pragmatic sanction. What Charles had once believed to be a shield against foreign aggression was swiftly disregarded by his former allies. France, Spain, and Bavaria openly challenged Maria Theresa's right to the throne. Charles Albert of Bavaria declared his claim to the imperial dignity, and in a move that would have enraged Charles VI from beyond the grave, allowed himself to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in early 1742 as Charles VII. For the first time in 3 centuries, a non-Habsburg held the imperial title. Maria Theresa's government was stunned. The coronation of Charles VII was not just a dynastic insult, it was a full rejection of the Habsburg monopoly on the Holy Roman crown, a repudiation of decades of political labor by her father. His obsessive concern for legacy, which had bordered on mania, had proved insufficient. The unity he sought through law had not withstood the test of power politics. In effect, the crown Charles VI had worn with such burden had crumbled under the weight of his own insecurities. The repercussions spread rapidly. In Hungary, noble support for Maria Theresa was tepid. The Hungarian Diet had accepted the pragmatic sanction only after long negotiation, and now faced with foreign invasions and internal instability, many nobles questioned their allegiance. It was only through an emotional appeal to their honor, Maria Theresa's famous plea before the Diet, where she appeared in mourning dress, cradling her infant son, that the nobility pledged troops and funding. That dramatic moment, while later celebrated in Habsburg propaganda, concealed the hard truth the monarchy was bargaining for its survival. The imperial army neglected during Charles VI's later years was in poor condition. Officers were divided by language, origin, and loyalty. Supplies were inconsistent. Recruitment lagged. Charles had invested enormous resources into ceremonial and administrative bureaucracy, but comparatively little into modernizing or expanding the military. His own obsession with internal discipline and legal precision had failed to prepare the empire for external war. Now, under Maria Theresa's fledgling leadership, the Habsburgs were forced into reactive campaigns to defend their holdings on multiple fronts. Compounding the military crisis was the breakdown of alliances. Britain, while formally supportive of Austria, hesitated to commit large forces. France, always eager to undermine Habsburg influence, began backing the anti-Maria Theresa coalition, not only supporting Charles VII, but funding proxy forces in Italy and Germany. Spain, nursing old territorial ambitions in the Italian peninsula, moved to reassert its influence there, further stretching Austrian forces. What Charles had feared, a war of attrition against Austria's flanks, had arrived in full force just weeks after his death. The psychological toll of this collapse was deeply felt within the court. Diaries of courtiers and foreign envoys alike describe a Vienna that had become dour defensive and bitterly divided. Some continued to speak of Charles VI with reverence, others increasingly with resentment. The emperor's final years were now viewed through the lens of failure. His court's preoccupation with ceremony and surveillance, once seen as careful governance, was criticized as insular and paranoid. What good were his rituals, his legal decrees, his alchemical precautions, if the empire was now surrounded by enemies and ruled by a woman who had inherited a throne of broken promises? Even in death, Charles's influence loomed over the court. His instructions for succession, compiled in a thick, leather-bound volume titled Testamentum Imperatoris, had been meant as a guidebook for the transition. But ministers found them increasingly irrelevant. Some of his decrees contradicted others. Several key diplomatic assumptions, such as French neutrality or Prussian cooperation, had already collapsed. Maria Theresa herself reportedly found the document of little use in war, as she scribbled in the margins of a copy with frustration. There were darker consequences as well. In the imperial crypt, Charles's body lay beneath a marble slab bearing his titles, but not his legacy. That legacy was being written elsewhere in the halls of foreign courts on the fields of Silesia, and in the increasingly desperate memoranda of his former ministers. Gerard van Sweden, now returned to court as a medical reformer, privately lamented that the emperor's paranoia had blinded him to the real threats facing the monarchy. In letters preserved in the Viennese archives, he wrote of Charles's final illness not as a tragedy, but as a mirror to the empire's own delusions. And yet, amidst the wreckage, there were glimmers of resilience. Maria Theresa, though overwhelmed and under-resourced, refused to surrender. Her resolve, hardened by personal grief and political humiliation, became a galvanizing force. The memory of her father's decline, his mutterings, his hallucinations, his failure to prepare seemed to push her in the opposite direction. Where he had relied on protocol and control, she relied on force and reform. Within months, she overhauled the tax system, began rebuilding the army, and purged court officials deemed incompetent or disloyal. Still, the psychological shadow of Charles VI lingered. The Empress insisted that her father's private chambers in the Hofburg be sealed and never entered again. The furnishings were left intact. His favorite crucifix remained on the desk. The locked doors became a symbol of both mourning and warning, a silent reminder of what obsession, fear, and isolation had wrought. As Europe descended into full-scale war, one fact became increasingly clear. Charles VI's death had not only ended an era, but had exposed the hollow foundations beneath his rule. His final days, filled with pain delusion and a desperate grasp for control, reflected the unraveling of the very empire he had sought to preserve. And in that unraveling, a new chapter of European history began, not with grandeur, but with collapse. The war that followed Charles VI's death would rage for 8 years, dragging much of Europe into a brutal contest over the spoils of Habsburg vulnerability. Known to history as the War of the Austrian Succession, it was the direct consequence of a reign that ended not in strength or triumph, but in delirium and uncertainty. The empire Charles had ruled with such anxious precision was now divided, its borders threatened, and its political standing deeply diminished. The legacy he left behind was one of legalistic idealism that collapsed the moment it encountered realpolitik. Maria Theresa, though initially overwhelmed, rose quickly to the demands of wartime leadership. Her transformation from young consort to sovereign ruler was rapid and ruthless. She began to consolidate power, restructure the military, and assert her authority in ways her father never had. While Charles VI had governed from within a maze of decrees and rituals, his daughter governed through necessity. Where he hesitated, she acted. Where he had trusted only in paper guarantees, she trusted in arms. But the trauma of her father's final days lingered in her court, and not only as a private sorrow. Maria Theresa inherited not just his titles, but also the suspicion and superstition that had saturated the Hofburg in the last year of his life. She quietly retained many of the protocols Charles had instituted to prevent poisoning, and even as late as 1742, food tasters remained an informal but constant presence in her household. While she rarely spoke of her father publicly, ministers close to her noted that she sometimes referred to him as the last of the dreamers, a cutting phrase that captured both admiration and frustration. The rituals surrounding Charles II's burial also became a source of continued unease. According to an internal memorandum from the Capuchin order, one of the monks who had helped enter the emperor claimed to hear knocking sounds from the tomb days after it was sealed. While likely apocryphal or symbolic, such stories circulated widely in Vienna, fueling the perception that Charles's soul remained restless, that his death had not brought peace to the dynasty he left behind. In the empire's provinces, particularly in Hungary and the Austrian Netherlands, unrest simmered. Local officials received contradictory orders, often signed in the name of Maria Theresa, but based on decrees left behind by her father. One particularly destabilizing incident occurred in Moravia, where a regiment refused to redeploy without explicit instructions from the late emperor. The officers claimed that the command protocols had not been properly updated, and thus no new sovereign had legal authority over them. Such confusion was not uncommon. Charles VI's bureaucratic legacy was thorough but labyrinthine, and few dared to override his codified procedures even after his death. The Catholic Church also grappled with the implications of Charles's final days. While public masses were offered for his soul, private ecclesiastical debates raised uncomfortable questions. Had the emperor died in a state of grace, or had his madness and fear signaled divine punishment? A particularly controversial sermon in Innsbruck hinted that Charles had been tested in ways that stripped the veil from sovereign pride, a veiled critique that stirred protests from the imperial court. Church officials were reminded to treat the late emperor's memory with dignity and circumspection, a clear signal that the court was not prepared to tolerate speculation about his sanity. Yet speculation continued, particularly among foreign observers. In France, pamphleteers mocked Charles's mushroom-induced demise, portraying it as symbolic of the empire's decay. In Prussia, Frederick II privately described the emperor as a ghost who ruled by parchment, and openly questioned whether Maria Theresa's claim could be taken seriously when her predecessor had fallen by his own fears. In Britain, sympathies were mixed, but even sympathetic voices acknowledged that the Habsburg dynasty had revealed alarming vulnerabilities. One of the most telling measures of Charles VI's legacy was how his political manuals and personal notes were treated after his death. Stored in locked cabinets within the Hofburg, these documents were initially intended to guide Maria Theresa, but many were quickly deemed obsolete. Several key advisors advised discarding them altogether. A few were discreetly burned. Those that survived were studied less as instructions and more as psychological documents, artifacts of a ruler whose final years had been dominated by a mind at war with itself. What the empire had witnessed in 1740 was more than the death of a monarch. It had been a public unmasking of the imperial psyche, one filled with fear of betrayal, fear of decline, fear of judgment, both temporal and eternal. Charles VI in his final days had embodied the contradictions of his reign: absolute power with fragile conviction, ceremonial grandeur masking personal doubt, and a quest for legacy that ended in disintegration. And for all the attempts to suppress or sanitize his death, those contradictions could not be erased. They lived on in his daughter's cautious reforms in the empire's defensive posture, in the whispered stories passed down through court servants and military officers. The Holy Roman Emperor had not been assassinated by enemies or overthrown by revolution. He had simply decayed mind and body under the crushing weight of a burden too vast for one man to carry. History would not judge Charles VI with the drama of his French namesake, nor with the heroism of earlier emperors. Instead, it would remember him as a man caught in the machinery of his own making, undone not by external force but by the internal pressures of legacy paranoia and unrelenting fear. In the end, the tragedy of Charles VI was not merely that he died in pain or that his empire collapsed into war. It was that for all his effort he had tried to command history itself, and history refused to obey. The final days of Emperor Charles VI marked not only the end of a reign, but the slow unraveling of an entire imperial worldview. His death in 1740, painful, confused, and shrouded in fear, would ripple outward, setting into motion a series of events that changed the political landscape of Europe for a generation. The war that followed cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and redrew the boundaries of influence between old dynasties. But beneath the geopolitical outcomes lies a more intimate, unsettling truth. The collapse of a mind can mirror the collapse of an empire. Charles VI, though never revered as a great statesman or reformer, was emblematic of a particular age of monarchy, one that prized ritual over adaptation, legacy over flexibility, and legalism over pragmatism. He spent his life building a scaffolding of decrees, titles, and protocols meant to safeguard the Habsburg succession. Yet when his moment came, the very instruments he had relied upon proved brittle. His mental deterioration, likely accelerated by both illness and fear, revealed how deeply the strains of rule could penetrate a sovereign's psyche. His daughter Maria Theresa would go on to become one of the most effective rulers of her era. But her reign was defined by reaction, by the need to repair and reform what her father had left broken. She modernized the administration, empowered the army, and fought to reclaim what had been lost. And in so doing, she distanced herself from the shadow of Charles VI. Where he clung to ancestral memory, she forged ahead with reluctant realism. Still, the memory of her father's decline remained embedded in the empire's consciousness. It served as a cautionary tale of unchecked absolutism, of the dangers of insularity and obsessive control. The final image of Charles VI, fevered, hallucinating, clutching at ghosts, and muttering of judgment, became a private symbol among Habsburg elites of how power, when wielded without perspective, can destroy the very order it seeks to protect. Centuries later, historians continue to debate whether Charles was poisoned, whether he succumbed to madness, or whether he simply fell victim to the limits of 18th century medicine. But in the broader narrative of history, the precise cause is less important than the consequence. His reign ended not with a triumph or a grand finale, but with a quiet, terrifying descent, one that exposed the fragility of even the most ornate crowns. And as his empire slipped into war, the ghost of Charles VI remained not in the battlefield, but in the empty throne room in the sealed chambers of the Hofburg, and in the collective memory of a dynasty forced to reckon with what it means to outlive its own illusions.